Hello, Soundies. Welcome to our Sound for Video session. It's good to have you all here today and hope you're all doing well, staying cool enough or warm enough, depending on where you're at. Um, let's go ahead and jump on over to our agenda and take a look at what we're going to be talking about today. First of all, we review this signal chain. It gets a little repetitive, but we do it because people ask and are curious. And so we're back on the same signal chain that we've been using for a while, with one little variation that we'll explore later in the episode or the live stream here. So this is the Earthworks Ethos microphone that I'm speaking into presently. This goes into the Rupert Neve Design Shelford channel, which incidentally uses a number of transformers, and we'll talk a little bit more about that today. The line output of that, the Shelford channel incidentally, is a preamplifier, an EQ, and a compressor, and a what's the right term? It has a silk, what they call a silk circuit as well, which includes a variety of a transformer that colors the sound a little bit. That's actually turned off right now at the moment. We'll explore that a little later. That goes line out into the Canon C200 camera, which we're using here as our main camera. That, of course, combines the audio and video, sends it to the ATEM Mini Extreme ISO. We send the HDMI output from that into a Decimator 12G cross, which is a cross converter, converts it from HDMI to SDI. That sends it out to the other room where we have a Epiphan Pearl Nano that encodes it and sends it to YouTube. We also have right down here a Sound Devices Mix Pre, and Danny's mic is on that. Danny, how are you today? Wait a second. I'm going to do some active mixing here. Go ahead.
I'm doing fine today, thank you. How about yourself?
All good here. Okay. All right, we're going to come back and Danny, you're going to be. I didn't tell you about this. We have a little surprise for you as well. So stand by.
Well, okay.
Stand by. So let's talk about transformers. I am just a little. This is just really kind of a layperson's look at transformers. I am not an electrical engineer. I don't know a ton about electronics, but I do want to talk about where transformers are used in audio, and I think it's helpful to understand that for a lot of practical reasons. You don't have to understand all of the ins and outs, the minute details necessarily, but I do think it's important to have a kind of a general understanding of what they do and where they're useful. So let's first go to the overhead camera. Let me just show you a couple of practical examples here of transformers for audio. So we have one here that's actually a microphone splitter, so you can input a microphone here, and we'll demonstrate this later. You can output that microphone here, but you can also output it through a couple of different isolated outputs here. So if you need to feed your microphone to multiple destinations, maybe a mixer and an audio recorder, for example, you can do that. And actually, I bought this actually recently so that I could measure the latency through the Rodecaster Pro 2. And I'll talk about how I did that in just a little bit here. This is another one. This is just a very simple input and output. This is a line isolator. So you would send a line level signal through here. It goes through a transformer, and then it's output here. And it provides some isolation. And I'll talk about what that means in more practical terms here in just a second. All right, let's go back to our presentation here. Transformers. We're not talking about the cars that turn into robots here. That's a completely different topic. We don't cover that here. We're going to talk about the electronic components here, or the electrical components here, and what they do. And specifically in the context of audio, they're used for a lot of different things. So for example, they can be used to step voltage up, to increase voltage on a circuit, or maybe drop the voltage. And so they're used in a lot of power applications. But in audio, they're a little bit different. And I want to talk about, first of all, how they work. This, again, super high level, just so, so that you can understand in general what they do. So on the left-hand side, we have this red wire. This is a copper wire in this case, so let's assume. And the copper wire comes in and is actually wrapped around, it's wound around part of a transformer core. Okay, and it's wound a certain number of times depending on what you're trying to accomplish with the transformer. And then you also have this, so that's called the primary winding. There's a secondary winding on the other side of that transformer core that's also wound around the core. and that's called the secondary winding. And you can wind them different number of times depending on what you're trying to do with this particular transformer. In audio, in many cases, there's actually the difference between the number of times it's wound on the primary versus the secondary is referred to as the turn ratio. Okay, and different turn ratios will do different things for you. They will either step up voltage or they'll step down voltage, or they can do things with impedance. They can do a variety of different things. But in audio, at least for isolation, they're typically the same number of turns on both the primary and the secondary. And what happens is that when you put a current through the primary winding, because it's wound around this transformer core, it actually creates an electromagnetic, energy. And what that does is it essentially makes it so that you can take the current, and again, this is alternating current at this point, from the primary winding, and it creates that same alternating current on the secondary winding. So it essentially passes the electrical current from one winding or one set of wires to another without ever touching each other. They never physically touch each other, and those electrons in that first current through the primary winding never go over into the secondary winding. So it creates this isolation, and it works through the magic of electromagnetic force. So it's kind of an interesting thing. Now, in this particular diagram, you'll see that there are more windings on the primary winding than on the secondary. In audio, a lot of times it's the same, at least when you're working with an isolating transformer, which is going to be our kind of primary focus here today. Okay, so that's a high level, very layperson's sort of description of a transformer. Okay, so let's talk about where you can use these in practical terms. Incidentally, before we move on from that, let me go back. This same principle of electromagnetics with electromagnetic fields actually apply for wireless charging as well. So if you're wirelessly charging your phone or your toothbrush, which just sits on a little holder where there's no like metal contacts that take place, they're using electromagnetic fields like this to generate or to charge that device. So there are lots of applications, lots and lots of applications, and we're only going to touch on a few of them here today. So practical applications. Let's talk about this a little bit. Okay. The first one is isolation. And in fact, these two devices that I showed you earlier, and Danny, if we can go back to the overhead camera on those, that's really what these are meant to do, is that they provide isolation. So in fact, this one, the Ice Cube, is called an IC1 balanced line isolator. And so what that does is that when you're interconnecting two pieces of audio gear, what you don't want to have happen is you don't want one to create a hum or a buzz on the other. And that can happen for a variety of reasons. Oftentimes you have a ground loop if they're using two different electrical mains circuits and they're connected to different grounds. You can get this hum or buzz that results from that. But it also so it can get rid of those. And there's actually a ground lift here, you'll notice. So that's an additional feature here. Also on these isolated outputs, there are also ground lifts. So you can eliminate those ground loops, but it also isolates using the transformer. And so there have been cases, for example, when I've had a lot of people ask me, hey, I've attached my camera to the top of my mix pre, my Sound Devices mix pre, and I'm getting a hum as soon as I do that. But as soon as I separate them, I don't have a hum anymore. And that's another case where an isolator like one of these can potentially solve that problem. So that's one application here. If, for example, you are sending audio to two separate devices, so here in the case of the mic splitter, yesterday I connected a microphone up to the JS3. So there's a microphone input right here. And then I connected this direct through, or direct out, you can think of it as an output, I guess, directly to a Sound Devices mix pre. And then I sent this isolated output to my Rodecaster Pro 2. And then I sent the output of the Rodecaster Pro 2 into the mix pre. And you might think, well, why'd you do this? What's the purpose of this? This was an opportunity for me to measure latency. So I could use one microphone and record directly to the mix pre, and that same microphone signal, send it to the Rodecaster Pro 2 and then from the Rodecaster Pro 2 into the mix pre and record that at the same time on a separate channel. And the idea is, and then I would have a recording that I could take a look at. And in fact, Danny, if you would switch over to the Mac here, that's exactly what we have here. So on channel number 1 on the top here, this is the recording direct to the mix pre out of the mic splitter. And the bottom one is what was recorded from the Rodecaster. So that microphone went through the mic splitter into the Rodecaster and then into the mix pre. So it was delayed a little bit. And in fact, let me just show you what that accomplishes for. So if I zoom way in, here's some claps that I did in that recording. I'm going to zoom way in here. Let's move it over to the left here. And you can see there's a delay. You can see how they're out of phase, but you can see this right here is the same as this right here. And if I actually highlight between those two, you can see down here, it's really tiny, but I'll read it for you. But this selection is 0.006 seconds. That is 6 milliseconds long. So what I was able to measure there is that there is a 6 millisecond input to analog output latency on the Rodecaster Pro 2. That was a question that a lot of people had, and so I wanted to find a way that I could measure that and give that information just as a piece of information. So if people are considering buying it, what kind of latency are you looking at? Incidentally, I did this measurement both with the headphone output and the line output, and it was 6 milliseconds both times. I also turned the effects in the Rodecaster Pro 2 on, and then turned them off and measured, and it was always 6 milliseconds. So there's a consistent 6 millisecond analog input to analog output latency on the Rodecaster Pro 2. So that was one kind of practical use case for having a mic splitter like this, where I could do that. Now, you could probably, since audio quality didn't really matter in this case, all I wanted was the clap and being able to compare the two of them. I probably could have just used a cable splitter instead, but in future situations, this one with the transformer may be helpful to me as well. Okay. So let's go on back to our presentation here. So isolation. So let's, there's the splitters again, and then here's the presentation. So isolation is one big thing. So a lot of times, again, you get that hum, and especially, for example, if you were getting a feed from a mixing board and feeding it to a recorder, something like an isolation transformer can be really helpful, just to make sure that the two systems don't interact in some way that creates hum or buzz or something that's going to be problematic for you. Another thing, in vintage studio gear especially, but not just in vintage studio gear, and actually in some of the more recent gear as well. In fact, this Rupert Neve Design Shelfer channel that we're using today intentionally uses transformers on the input, and actually they have another one on the output in this case. And they were originally, from my understanding, originally put there as a way to provide isolation. However, they also imposed a little bit of harmonic distortion, which was a sound that a lot of people really, really liked, especially for music production, for vocals, even for instrument recordings. That harmonic distortion was really quite pleasant. And in fact, what it did is it mostly emphasized, it took some of the lower frequencies and distorted them in a very kind of subtle and pretty pleasant way. And that's part of, you're hearing that right now through the Shelfer channel. And it's just for music production in particular, not so much for video and not so much for film, although I think sometimes they are doing some magic on the bigger budget films. That's one of the other kind of features, if you will, and why a lot of people that are working in music recording still use vintage or vintage styled gear that have transformers of various sorts on their input stages and potentially on their output stages as well. All right, another thing is impedance matching, and I'm not going to get into all of the details here, but a lot of times, for example, certainly with live sound reinforcement, you have to do some impedance matching, and it's usually the power amplifiers will take care of this for you, but they'll take the output from the mixing board and get it up to the right impedance, or get it down to the right impedance for the loudspeakers. So there's some other things that transformers can do in those circumstances as well. So just another thing to keep in mind there. Okay, let's go back out to the chat and let's see what we've got going in the chat here today. Any questions you might have? Again, I'm not an electrical engineer, so I don't know all the ins and outs, but that's kind of the general idea. And then in just a moment here, we're going to come back in and give you some demonstrations. Audio Buff, hey, Jude, it's good to have you here. George Westinghouse and Nikola Tesla helped bring this technology to the table in the late 1800s. Very good. Thank you so much, Jude, for the insights on the history there. Shoji Productions, in general, do isolation transformers degrade the audio signal in any way? That is a fantastic question, Shoji. I think it's worth looking at and listening to a sample here. So what we're going to do is, let's go back to the overhead. I'm going to go ahead and take this. This is the mic splitter. So let's just take this. And we've got Danny on a microphone. And so what we're going to do is I'm going to take Danny's microphone, which was currently going into the mix pre, and I'm going to bring it here into the mic splitter. I have this all muted right now, so we should be good. Okay, so that's going to the input. I have two other cables here. All right, now again, on this particular unit, you have a direct output, and so this actually connects directly to whatever device you connect it to. And the reason for that is if you're bringing a microphone in that needs phantom power, you need some way to get the phantom power in. This device itself is not powered in any way. It's a passive device. The main output, or the output we're going to connect directly to the mix pre, is this one here. So I'm going to get the output cable here, plug that in there, and I'm going to take that into input number 1 on the mix pre. I don't have that on camera, but you'll have to trust me on that. All right, the next thing we're going to do here is we're going to take the balanced output, the isolated balanced output right here, and also feed that into the mix pre on a different channel so that we can hear Danny direct without the transformer and through the transformer. We're going to check and see if we can hear a difference there. So I'm going to go ahead and plug that in there, make sure that we don't need the ground lift, I don't think, at this point. Okay, and this is going to go into channel 2. Okay, so now we've got that all set up. So we've got Danny coming into right here, going directly out without going through the transformer into the mix pre here, and that's on channel 1 on the mix pre, and then on channel 2 on the mix pre, we're sending it through the Jensen transformer in this device here and into the mix pre. So with that, let me go ahead and unmute here and let's hear what Danny sounds like first without. I'm going to have to mute myself. Give me just a second here.
Test 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. How's it going today? All right. I don't have anything else to say. It's kind of a quiet Sunday.
This is without the transformer.
Okay. Without the transformer, I'm talking more. All right. Curtis tells me this is with the transformer. I'm still talking. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 4, 3, 2, 1. 0, -1. 0, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5.
Without the transformer.
Okay, now we're without the transformer again. This is Danny talking on some sort of Shure mic. I didn't check it before we started streaming. So there we have it.
Okay, let's go back to our main screen here. Curious if you all heard a difference there. So with and without the transformer, I think if there is a difference, it's fairly subtle. I think part of the design of this particular box here is to be as transparent as possible. Not so much with some of the analog gear. They're intentionally trying to, a lot of times they're trying to make the overall audio sound warmer, and they're taking advantage of that characteristic of some transformers where it will pick out some of the lower frequencies and subtly distort them with harmonic distortion that actually can sound quite nice. So I'm curious in the chat, Was anyone able to hear a difference between those two? What was your experience there?
We have other questions too. Can
Oh
we?
yeah, while we're waiting for that, let's go to the other questions, see what we've got. So thanks, Shoji, so much for the question. That's a great question. Matt, is there any delay inside the mic splitter isolated versus direct out electronically? There could be a very, very small amount. I could make a recording and measure that, but I wouldn't expect a big difference. We're using 25-foot cables in each case. With an analog piece of gear like this, it should be very, very small. But it's a great question. That will give me something to do and to measure. I don't think we should probably do it here on the spot, but I think I will do that measurement and just see out of curiosity. Thanks, Matt. Good question.
Here's what people thought.
Okay, here are the impressions. Okay, impressions. I don't think I heard any noticeable difference. Okay. Again, we're coming through YouTube, so we're going to AAC. We're getting into a lossy format. I couldn't hear a difference, Andy noted. Mark didn't hear any difference in the audio paths. Sounded the same to me. And that was my general impression as well. I didn't notice any sort of major coloring. Again, part of that is the design of this particular device, which is meant to not, I think they intentionally made it with a very efficient transformer. And when they chose one from Jensen, which also is supposed to be very efficient as well. So anyway, in any case, that's what we got there. So it's a good question. I think at a practical level, the answer is that depending on the transformer, it's gonna differ from transformer to transformer. But the quality transformer like this, it didn't seem to make a substantive difference. But let's go look at the Mac here really quickly, and let me just show you. This is not a cheap device. $329.99 for that splitter. So it's a little bit more of the premium. Radial Engineering usually does a pretty good job. I think a lot of people consider them a little bit on the higher end when it comes to these types of boxes. And they produce all sorts of them. In fact, Danny has a preamplifier for her fiddle that is made by Radial Engineering as well. They make great stuff. So you can get less expensive ones, of course, as well. And the less expensive ones, in fact, if we look over here, there's just a picture of some kind of basic transformers that you can buy. This is just over at Amazon here. $6.50 for 5. Just so you know what they look like in practical terms. Maybe another view here of what they look like.
The do-it-yourself version. That looks like the do-it-yourself version.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, it is. So if you're working on an electronics project, there's another option there for you. Okay, let's actually talk about another thing. So here's the documentation here for the Shelford channel. And it has a dual tap transformer output with variable silk. And we've actually done this little experiment here before. But this is where they're intentionally using a transformer to color the sound in some way. And it has 2 different modes. And I'll kind of crank it up to the max here so you can hear what it sounds like. But let's go back to the main shot here, Danny. Let me go ahead and demonstrate for you that it has 2 different modes. I call it a red mode and a blue mode. They call this their silk transformer. Red will actually capture some of the higher frequencies and distort them in a harmonic sort of subtle way. Whereas the blue will take the lower frequencies and distort those in a harmonic way. Let me give you some demonstrations here. Okay, here is the red silk, and you'll probably notice that those high frequencies are possibly screaming just because of our signal chain and my voice. And this is what it sounds like at the max setting. And then I'm going to switch over to the blue silk. Here is the blue silk, and you'll probably hear a little bit more low end or a little bit more maybe distortion on the low end. And again, in a harmonic sort of subtle way that's supposed to be really pleasing to hear. And then I've turned it off. So now we're back to normal. So there's a little bit, probably a subtle difference there as well. And again, that's a case where they are intentionally using a transformer to color the sound. So the answer, Shoji, to your question is yes, sometimes it can very much. And it's intentionally doing that. Other times they're trying to be a little bit more transparent. I would say that when you go with the lower quality things, it's likely that you're going to get some coloration, and probably not in the most pleasant of ways. So just something to keep in mind, or maybe you will really like the coloration. It depends on what you're trying to do, but in any case, there are some things that happen there with transformers and how they process audio. Okay, what else have we got there in the chat? Christopher, that's another benefit of transformers. They can convert unbalanced to balanced to facilitate longer cable runs. That's exactly what a DI box or a direct injection box does. Thank you, Christopher. I'm glad you brought that up. That's another case where you do see them, especially more in music and especially live, but also in recordings. When you're working with an instrument output that is unbalanced, you usually put it through a DI box that turns it into a balanced signal so you can run a longer cable to your recorder or mixing board or whatever you're using in that particular case. So oftentimes when someone's playing an acoustic instrument with a pickup, you will see them plug in, and you'll see usually a little box on the stage as well. That's usually a DI box that's converting that unbalanced signal from their instrument into a balanced signal so they can run it up to the board, the mixing board. If you didn't use a DI box in that circumstance, you'd probably lose a lot of the signal. It would degrade pretty substantially by the time it got to the mixing board. So that's the purpose of a DI box. DI boxes also typically have a ground lift as well. So that's interesting. Mike says it's worth commenting that the Jensen transformers are reckoned to be the best of the best. So yeah, they're definitely considered the higher end of the market there. Jensen transformers, which is now owned by Radial for what it's worth, are designed to be as transparent as possible. Other transformers are designed to impart color, like Neve-based designs. Thank you, Christopher. Completely agree. That's been my experience, as we just demonstrated and experienced here, for sure. On the latency measurement, did you measure from the big spike on one channel to the corresponding big spike on the second channel? Let's do that right now and see what we get. So if we come back over to our Mac, let's go ahead and check in on the big spike. And the big spike, as it turns out, has a couple of different spots here. So they're phase inverted, as you can see here. So this right here, I need to get in a little closer. This here corresponds. No, you can't be perfectly on it. I'm going to zoom out a little bit just to make this a little easier. This is where things get really jumpy. And then I'm going to take this and get to the start of the big spike. And we're still measuring 6 milliseconds to answer your question. So that's what that looks like, just as a visual there. Okay, so yeah, that looks like it measured. I actually measured it from the start of the overall. It was actually it wasn't just a single transient. When you do a clap, there's actually quite a bit of energy involved overall, but I measured initially from here to here, and we got 6 milliseconds there as well. So good question. Thank you for that. Okay, let's go back out to our main camera. Oh, Linda is commenting, did not hear a difference here. Same with me. I'm on Apple AirPod Maxes and they sounded the same. I have studio guys who could hear the difference and proved it. Very good. That's some great ear training. I think what the short version though is that when you're using a high quality transformer like a Jensen transformer, that the coloration is pretty subtle, and if anyone could hear it. In fact, I don't have a way to measure it here, but if we go here, so here is, we're still on the Mac, that's good. So here is here you're actually hearing a difference between the Mix Pre and the Rodecaster Pro 2 going through the transformer. So this is a couple of things, of course, but let's go ahead and play it. So first up, this is just the Mix Pre. All right, this is a test here to test our latency. I'm speaking into the Shure KSM 8, That's going into the Radial Engineering JS3 mic splitter. The direct output is coming into a mix pre-10. And here is through the splitter, the transformer, and the roadcaster. All right, this is a test here to test our latency. I'm speaking into the Shure KSM 8. That's going into the Radial Engineering JS3 mic splitter. The direct output is coming into a mix pre-10. All right, this is a test here to test our latency. I'm speaking into the Shure KSM 8. That's going into the Radial Engineering JS3 mic splitter. The direct output is coming into a mix pre-10. Okay, and just out of curiosity, let's bring up our real-time analyzer, our frequency analysis module, and let's go ahead and measure each of those recordings just out of curiosity to see how the frequency response differs. We'll scan that one, and then we will also scan this one. And then I'll switch back and forth between them. So this is the roadcaster and transformer. Here is the mix pre alone. So there are some measurable differences. Again, we're talking about both a transformer and a different preamplifier. But just out of curiosity, I could also do that recording, again, of Danny through the transformer and direct, and we would be able to see if there was any sort of substantive frequency power distribution difference between the two. But that's what we're looking at there. So good. Okay. Danny's combing through.
There's an interesting conversation about this.
Matt says, what the ballpark of that preamp you're using? Greater than or equal to $5,000. So the Shelfer channel, I don't know. Let's check.
Well,
If the pricing's changed.
We have some comments.
I'm going to go ahead and check. Shelford channel. It's now $4,000. When I bought it, it was less expensive than that. But yeah, it's a $4,000 preamp, compressor, EQ, and colorizer, I guess. I don't know what else you want to call it. So good question, Matt. Mike says, worth mentioning that you shouldn't put line signals through mic splitters. There are purpose-built line splitters.
And then,
Good note for that. Thank you, Mike. The Radial JS3 he's using is designed to take both mic and line signals with the pad button engaged. That's true. If we go back to the overhead, Mike, to your point, I think you're right. I think you have to be careful about that. You'll notice on this one, it does have this pad that's minus 30 dB, and in the documentation, they specifically note if you're going to be sending a line level signal, that applying that pad, you can do that. But I think, yeah, you just want to be careful and make sure that you understand the particular splitter that you're using and whether it's intended for that use or not. This one, thankfully for the price, it is intended for both, but not all of them are intended for both. So it's a good thing to keep in mind. Thanks for that. Audio Buff, I run into this question, this question a lot. Can you pass phantom power through a transformer? And the answer is no. That's correct. And in fact, if we come back here, if I show you this here on the JS3, if you're using a microphone that does require phantom power, you have to connect it to a device directly. So in other words, here, if I was recording to a mix, or if I was sending this microphone signal to a mixer and a recorder, what I would need to do is turn the phantom power on the mixer and use the direct through to connect to the mixer so that phantom power can come back from the mixer to the microphone. Okay, so when you go through the transformer, there's no way to feed phantom power. So this connected to the mix pre, if I turned on phantom power here, that would not supply the necessary voltage to the microphone. I have to do it over here on the direct through. And that's a great point that you bring up, Jude. Thanks so much for that. Okay. What else have we got going in the chat?
that's all related to
That's all for now? Okay.
that topic.
Let's go and let's take a look at our questions that we had submitted ahead of time. So we'll come back over to this here. Sorry for the very tiny writing. I will read it to you. There's a lot of context here I wanted to get into. Uh, Keith has a question about impedance and splitters. I use splitters a lot when I was recording local artists live at open mics, clubs, or even rehearsals, mostly for dynamic mics that were going to a PA, public address system, but sometimes for line or instrument level stuff that may or may not have gone through a passive DI, another transformer device, because I'd have a snake with everything from an 8-times splitter going into it to feed an F8. So the question is, I always wondered whether any kind of input device is direct through in some DIs. And that's, again, on the JS3, it had that through port there. Path would have its impedance changed by the interaction with the transformer. I honestly can't say I ever heard any difference, but these were live, noisy environments, and you'd hope the signal wouldn't be altered, but it just seems impossible that a transformer that can be induced to create an identical signal would not have some impact. I'm obviously not an electrical engineer, nor a man of few words, as my question and wife testify. Okay, thanks so much for that. On the through port, it doesn't go through a transformer, so you don't have that consideration. Yeah, so there should be no change to the impedance whatsoever. And in fact, if we go back to the overhead here, Danny, on the JS3 here, you'll note it's probably a little difficult to see, but it does indicate 600 ohm and 600 ohm here. So it's keeping the impedance the exact same through that particular path right there. Okay, so hopefully, Keith, that answers that question. Of course, we talked about the coloration that obviously based on your question, you're very well aware that transformers can create coloration, and indeed they do. In that particular case with the through, they shouldn't. So it'll just be in that case. So for example, if you're feeding the through to the mixing board and then the isolated output to your Zoom F8, I think is what you're referring to, it's possible that the Zoom F8 was getting a colored signal, but the mixing board should not have been. Okay. Mike, I'm glad you're here. Mike sent this to me as well. You may already have this on your agenda, but can you mention combiners as well as splitters? As you know, combining, say, left and right outputs to make a mono feed is not as simple as just soldering 2 sets of wires to one plug. Thanks for your ongoing high-quality reviews and Sunday sessions. Well, Mike, that is a piece of equipment I have never used or encountered. And in fact, typically, if I'm going to feed left and right outputs, I would put it into a mixer first, but I am now intrigued by this whole concept of a combiner, and I'm curious how it works because, as we know, if you're taking a stereo mix with left and right outputs, there's going to be some potential constructive, destructive interference between the two channels, which is part of what makes the stereo effect. And I would be curious to know what a combiner does and how it treats that situation. So Mike hasn't been on the show for a long time. Mike, maybe it's time to come back on the show again. I think it was right 2015 last time you were here, but I'd love to hear more about that. And if you've got anything you can share in the chat, we'd love to hear that in the meantime. Okay, on to our third and final question. I've been doing some slow motion dragonfly, damselfly videos lately, shooting at 240 frames per second and producing on a 30 frames per second timeline. I found appropriate music to include with the videos, but I would like to know what the usual practice is for background ambient audio for these slow motion videos. I can record some wind noise or other ambient sounds myself, add that as a separate track under the music, which is what I suspect will work fine, but I never really thought about what is appropriate for such a slow motion. What are your thoughts? I can tell you that my experience with slow motion depends on what the effect is you're trying to do. This is purely sound design at this point. You get to make whatever decision makes sense for you. And so I would experiment with it. If you do go out and record effects that you're going to slow down, I would record them at a higher sample rate. Because that way when you slow them down, you're going to have more samples to work with as you slow it down. So in my experience on one of the short films we worked on, we had an instrument maker. It was a very short documentary piece about an instrument maker. And one of the shots we had was him using a plane, or was it a chisel? I think it was a chisel actually, to kind of start to shape the wood. And so we recorded that at 192 kilohertz. And of course, the director and DP I was working with filmed it. I don't know if they did it at 240 frames per second. I think they were just filming it at 60 and slowed it from there. In any case, in post, that was a case where it made sense to slow the sound effect down as well. It actually gave a really great effect for that particular piece, but you'll just need to experiment and see what works best. In this case, I'm not sure that slowing it down would work, but it's definitely worth a try. So get out there and make those recordings, Joe, and let's see what happens. I'm curious to see what you find. All right. So those are the questions we had submitted ahead of time. Let's pop back out and let's talk in the chat. We have a little bit of time just to chat it up. So Danny's going to comb through and see what we've got going out there from Shoji. Do you have any production experience with ambisonics? If so, can you tell us about your experience? I have done one ambisonic recording. We were out digging fossils last November, and maybe it was that in December, November, whenever it was.
November.
November, okay. And we were working. Was that shale?
Yes.
Shale. Okay, so shale. There was this outcrop where the shale had crumbled quite a bit, and so there were all these basically rock chips. And I set the microphone up, and I was just really curious. I was able to walk around the microphone, and the experience of being able to hear the spatial information was absolutely fascinating. So that's my one experience. It's not been used anywhere. It was just an experiment on my part. But that's my only experience so far. Now, here's the thing that's interesting to me about ambisonics. I think ambisonics, you're going to start to see more and more of that in films, especially as most theaters now have some sort of surround system, but a lot of them are also, at least on the higher end, are also getting Atmos systems, which are really sophisticated surround, basically, with more speakers and the ability to also work in another dimension, so the height dimension as well as the, just surround. So they're able to do some more interesting things. A lot of that, though, that mixing, not all of it, but sometimes they'll record ambiances with an ambisonic microphone and just put that in as a sort of a base layer when they're doing the sound design, from my understanding. But when they are actually trying to give the sense of movement, a lot of times they're using mono recordings of that particular object, and they can actually mix where it shows up spatially in the space using the Atmos system. So they can actually make it sound like it's above and behind you, or below and behind you, or as it comes across, it can fly across above you and then down as it goes over the horizon. They can do all sorts of amazing things in a 3D space. So you can do a lot with Dolby Atmos, which is really, really impressive and fun. So the other place where, of course, ambisonics recordings can be really useful is in virtual reality types of situations. So if you record with a 3D camera, or a 360-degree camera, excuse me, if someone's using one of the goggles, the VR goggles, as they turn, the spatial information adjusts, so you're getting that effect as if you were there in person. So that's another case where I think you're going to see it, where you already see it quite a lot. So obviously in games as well. And also for, again, I don't know if this is happening at the recording during the production or in post, but then of course there's the Apple spatial sound experience, which is basically a form of, I think, Dolby Atmos, and you can experience it in your headphones as well. They can do a down conversion for binaural, which is headphones in that case. So anyway, those are some of my thoughts. I don't have extensive experience with it. I'm not an expert by any means, but that's my understanding of it and what I've experienced so far. Silk is a saturation circuit. No? Well, here's exactly what Rupert Neve Design says about it. They say, similar to the input stage, a new output stage is designed to provide the texture and power of Rupert's classics while allowing for significantly more versatility in tone. The dual tap output for the channel's RN2042 square core output transformer creates both high and low headroom outputs while without compromising the Shelfer channel's performance. The high headroom tap is designed to capture a more pristine sound at high levels, avoiding nonlinear coloration of the output stage and taking full advantage of the Shelfer's higher voltage design. The low headroom tap, however, is optimized to allow an engineer to drive the full voltage range of the channel, adding dynamic tone with these same nonlinear colorations without clipping most professional interfaces. Another advantage of this output stage versus vintage models is the addition of the variable silk circuitry, which allows complete control over the harmonic content and saturation of the output transformer. So, yeah, I think technically, Christopher, you're right. I think it essentially mixes the extent to which you're adding that output transformer, the colored version of the output transformer. So, yeah. Exciting, fun stuff. Some would say, why are you messing with that stuff? Why for talking or spoken word, why are you even messing with that whatsoever? It's art. Yenzo, what lavalier set would you recommend that has a single receiver to 2 or more transmitters? I've seen a couple of those around, but would be interested in your recommendation. I think that depends on whether you're looking what purpose you're looking at it for, whether you're doing this work professionally or if it's for recording YouTube videos for fun or what the case may be. If on the consumer end, the Rode Wireless Go 2 is one worth looking at. DJI has a dual channel, we call that dual channel wireless system. So you've got 2 transmitters to a single receiver. On the professional end, there are lots of options from Shure, Axient Digital, to Electrosonics, to Wizicom, to Zaxcom, to Sound Devices. There are lots of different professional wireless systems that have dual and even quad channel receiver systems. Wizicom has a quad channel receiver. So you can actually transmit 4 transmitters to a single receiver. So completely different leagues, obviously. I mean, we're talking about the Rode Wireless Go 2, which I think is somewhere around $300 for 2 transmitters and a single receiver. Up to, easily multiple thousands of dollars per channel on the professional grade system. So it just really depends on whether you're doing this work professionally and getting paid for it, or you're making TikTok and YouTube videos or Instagram. All right. What is your best audio investment that either takes your sound to a new level or saves you a lot of time or maybe your work easier? Well, I think it depends on what you're doing. Again, whether you're doing like location or production sound versus recording, talking head or just spoken word audio in a setting like this, or maybe live streaming. So it depends. In my particular case, I really like the Shelfer channel for live streaming. It's obviously overkill. There are much less expensive ways to do this same thing too, by the way. Art makes a product, a channel, a vocal channel that also has a compressor, but is less than $1,000. So that's one thing. And the reason that's useful, I think, is that the compressor in and of itself, to get your levels to a consistent output level for live streaming, where you're not doing post-processing, that's super helpful. Obviously, the DBX286S is also a vocal channel strip that can really it can do all of those same things, and mostly. It doesn't really have an EQ. It has a de-esser and enhancers, but it also has a noise gate or an expander, as well as a compressor, so that can be really, really helpful. I think for a lot of people that are producing a lot of spoken word recorded content, that could save a lot of time in post. You have to get the settings right, because once you make the recording, it's all baked in. But if you really get it dialed in for your situation, for your setup, that can save you a lot of time in post. That's one thing. I think finding a microphone that fits your voice will save you time in post too. You're not going to have to be messing around with EQ endlessly. Although, if it's always your voice, then creating an EQ curve that you apply pretty generally is pretty straightforward, and just applying that every time if you do have a post-production cycle. If you're doing it live, you're going to have to send it through something else that can do that. But that's definitely possible. If you're using an ATEM, for example, if you pop over to the Mac here, we've got an equalizer. We could definitely do that. We could just Pop that on right here. Just set it and forget it. You can actually save it, and it would be applied every single time you go to live stream. So I think microphones and preamplifiers are from this particular use case are things that help a lot. Another thing that can help a ton if you're doing a multi-person podcast, for example, or a live stream. Let's say podcast. You're recording it ahead of time and then distributing it. Some sort of auto mix can save you a ton of time in post. That is a huge, huge advantage. And that can be software. There's the WT Auto Mix plugin that we demonstrated, I think, about a year ago. So if you're curious about that, that is a VST plugin that you can use with almost any digital audio workstation. The sound device is Mix Pre, the sound device is 8 series, pretty much all of the professional field recorders, but also the Zoom F series recorders have an auto mix feature as well. And that allows you to apply that mix, and you can also still record isolated channels. So if you don't like what the auto mix does, you can still always manually mix the whole thing in the end if you wanted to do that. But that can save a ton of time, because if you record, say, an hour-long podcast with 3 people, that's a lot of work to go in and actually clean that up and actually turn down the mics where the people are not currently talking and fade up the one that is. And then when someone else starts talking and then the other person starts talking, I mean, it's a lot of work to go and do that in post. If you want to get that level of production, using an auto mixer can save a ton of time. So those are my thoughts on that. I could probably keep going, but we should probably move on. All right, Rag and Bone Puppet Theater. For ambient slow motion, seems to me Foley would be the way to go. Yes. Thanks for that input. Christopher, Gavin from the Slow Mo Guys YouTube channel has a video talking about how he does audio for their slow-mo videos. Basically, he uses replacement audio as nothing sounds good slowed down. I wouldn't say nothing sounds good slowed down. I think it depends on the situation, but yeah, I can see the point. So Gavin does the audio work for the slow-mo channel. That would be a great one to go look up, Joe. So I would do a search for Slow Mo Guys audio on YouTube. Mike says, combiners stop the impedance load being halved, resistances in parallel, and in some situations prevent the left output trying to feed its signal back into the right output. Okay, that makes sense. Still, part 2. Okay, I'll read part 2. Also, if you try and combine 2 phantom-powered mics, you run the risk of generating a current if both phantom sources are not identical voltage. Good, yeah, good points on that. I still don't think it addresses the whole idea of, like, if you take a 2-channel stereo mix and you sum it, just literally blindly, mash it together, I would think it would do some things that wouldn't necessarily be what you would want in terms of constructive and destructive interference, comb filtering, so on and so forth. Maybe it would. I mean, it could. Yeah, it seems like they'd want to address that as well, which is why I would generally go through a mixer so you can hear what's happening. But I bet the use case is way better than I do for when you'd want to use a combiner. So that's a good one to know about. Thanks, Mike. All right. How efficient is to use portable recorders such as the Tascam DR10L instead of transmitters for narrative work? Is a sub $500 transmitter reliable, generally speaking? Okay, well, that's a big trade-off. I still see it that way, even with the 32-bit body pack recorder. So the Tascam DR10L, for those that are not aware, is a body pack recorder. It looks like a wireless transmitter. It's a little smaller, but it just records. It doesn't transmit wirelessly. The downside with something like that is, if there's something wrong with the audio, maybe the microphone, probably the most common thing, the microphone is, rubbing against the clothing and making a sort of horrible noise that's going to make that recording basically useless. That's one of the risks with those types of systems. You don't have a way to monitor them generally, although that's changing. I believe Tentacle Sync with their Track E recorder, which is sort of like the Tascam DR10L. You can now monitor it wirelessly via Bluetooth, so you have to be in fairly close proximity, but you can at least get a sense for what it sounds like. So that's one thing to consider. And then, of course, the advantage with wireless of any sort is that you can monitor it in real time from your mixer. So you know what you're getting. So if you're having a problem and you're working on the type of piece where you can do this, you can potentially say, hey, on the next take, we need to fix this lav mic. We're getting some rustle noise, or we lost battery power, or something like that. So those are the kind of things that's the trade-off between the two. $500, I mean, it depends on what you're doing. If you are recording indoors in a space where you can turn off wireless access points if you need to. Even the 2.4 gigahertz, and you're at close range all the time, a 2.4 gigahertz system can be just great. It can work fine. The problem comes in those other circumstances where you're not, and you don't have as much control, or there's a TV station that's transmitting in the frequency that you wanted to use. With a UHF system, you can actually switch to another frequency. And there's not a lot. I mean, there are some UHF systems that are less than $500, not very many, and all of them that I've used, I didn't really love them. Audio quality wasn't great, or the reliability wasn't that great. I would, if you're going to spend less than $500 and you're working indoors and you have control of the situation, pretty good control of the situation, and you're working in close proximity, I think a 2.4 gigahertz sub $500 system is just fine. If you're going to be working outdoors in the wide open, that's where 2.4 gigahertz systems tend to struggle a little bit more. They don't work well unless they're within line of sight. And that is to say, like if you're going to mount the transmitter pack and the person's facing the camera, you have to put it on the front of them instead of on the back of them. So if hiding it is important, that's where those become problematic potentially as well. So those are some thoughts. But again, if you're in close proximity, a lot of times those 2.4 gigahertz consumer systems are good enough. Oh, also, if you're running a lot of channels, if you're running more than 2 channels, that's when the consumer wireless systems generally tend to start falling apart pretty quickly. So that's my experience with them. You could potentially get away with 4 channels, but depends on where you're at and how lucky you are. So there's some thoughts there. Okay, sorry, I went on along on that one. Mark, DJI also makes a wireless mic system that gets really good reviews. Agreed. Yep, that's another one to look at. So the Rode Wireless Go DJI also has one. And it seems like everyone's trying to copy those two right now. DJI actually basically copied the Wireless Go with some new features as well. But yeah, lots of options out there. Thanks for the follow-up on lavalier question. It will be for professional use, corporate work, and short documentary. Very often camera operator, director, as well as a sound person. That's a lot going on for one person. If you're going to be in close proximity, I would start with a 2.4 gigahertz system.
This
Yeah.
was the one
Yep.
Yep.
Yep. Yep. Okay. Yep. So, I mean, it's just so hard to know. It depends on where you're at again. The problem with the UHF systems is that they take a little bit more work to set up, and it depends on what your budget is. How much can you spend? Let me just tell you that the wireless, the professional systems, and do you have an audio mixer, or are you recording straight into camera? That's another important question as well. If you're recording into camera, maybe the Sony UWP-D, the digital wireless system, could be worth checking. But there's just more work to set those up, just so you're aware. You get more flexibility and you have more ability to adapt to different situations, but it takes more time to set them up. For documentary, I mean, it's your choice. You have to decide what you're capable of doing in those circumstances. And if you don't have a dedicated sound person, okay, here it says you have a camera operator, director, and a sound person. Okay, yeah, I think a UHF system, but less than $500. I don't know. There's nothing I could recommend in a UHF system for less than $500. Maybe one of you out there in the chat, if you have something you can share, we'd love to hear about it. But from everything that I've used, anything less than $500, I probably would not recommend. So, okay, that's enough on that one. I think I've hopefully beat that one. Oh, yeah. So Mike brings up another thing. Treating your room acoustically. So we've obviously done some of that here. We have acoustic panels here. Depends again on what you're doing. Um, some people have that flexibility, some don't. If you're in a rented space, sometimes that's just not even an option. But yeah, that was definitely a good investment. We also will be reviewing something called SonarWorks Sound ID Reference here soon. So in addition to acoustic treatment, I wouldn't recommend just using something like SonarWorks. But what SonarWorks does is it actually, you get a microphone, a measurement microphone, you measure the response of your room by playing some test tones through your speakers, your near field monitors. And it creates a profile for playback for your monitors. And the advantage there is that it can address, potentially help to address, I should say, any of the particular types of problems you're experiencing in your room. So I would say that in addition to acoustic treatment can be a useful way to do that as well. Again, that's mostly going to be for if you're editing and mixing a lot in post. That could be a really helpful thing. Sound speeds. I'm not a fan of the wireless system built into the DJI Pocket 2. A lot of modulation and artifacting. And there's a man I would trust. So there's some input for you on the DJI system. Thanks, Alan. Daniel, best way to remove deep breaths in audio, either software or hardware. I just started with DaVinci Resolve. Well, Daniel, best from my point of view is to actually highlight the breath and reduce the gain. That's the best way to do it. There are some deep breath plugins. They're really hard to dial them in, and they don't always hit the right places. Like they end up reducing things that are not breaths, and so you get some artifacting there. They also don't catch all the breaths, and so there's always, I mean, even in the, RX has a deep breath or what they call breath control plugin or module. I've stopped using it. I've never been able to find a good way to get it really dialed in and working well. So the best way, from my point of view, if you're doing a really careful, high quality job, is to actually go and highlight each individual breath and gain it down.
Ooh, here's an interesting.
And by the way, Daniel, one last thing too, I would not remove breaths. It starts to sound really unnatural if you do that. Maybe some pieces would require that, but I would generally avoid that. I would reduce them, not eliminate them. Okay. How necessary is it to use limiters and low cuts either from the recorder or mic on set? I've seen post guys who'd rather have the sound be as original as possible without any on-set alterations. That's a great question. I think the trick now, how necessary is it, is your question technically. Well, there is one thing to consider with a low-cut filter or a high-pass filter. You actually lose a bit of headroom if you don't use one, potentially, depending on the circumstances. So from my point of view, I don't see a massive downside to using a high-pass or a low-cut on set if it's dialed in well, if it's not too aggressive. As far as limiters, all the production equipment has them. I think most mixers use them. The thing is, what do you do if you clip? Yes, there are declip plugins that post can use, but what it's doing is resynthesizing. It's taking its best guess as to what the waveform would have looked like if it hadn't clipped. They do a pretty good job. Limiters also color the sound to some extent, so it's a trade-off. My take is that the sound person on set doesn't always have the freedom to necessarily say, hey, we need to do a retake. We clipped there. I think a lot of times you'll get a lot of directors that will say, depends on the director, of course, but a lot of them will say, we're going to just fix that in post and move on. And I would probably have prefer to have a limiter there than no limiter. Anyway, that's my perspective on that. Would love to hear. Also, Alan, you're spending a lot of time on set. What's your take on that? And the mixers that you work with, what do they do? By the way, one of the things I forgot to mention earlier with transformers, before we wrap, I know we're over time.
We have a few more.
And we have a few more questions as well?
Yeah,
okay.
Yeah, that we need to.
All right, we need to address a few more questions. One other thing too, there is there's a field recorder that I understand has transformers on the inputs as well, and that is the Aton Digital Kantar X3. I don't know how much those transformers color the sound, but interestingly, they actually have added transformers on the inputs as well. Okay, next question.
These are comments on the breath issue.
We're back to the breath issue. I think the best way of removing breaths is taking some room tone and replacing the breath. Miguel, yeah, I mean, if you need to eliminate it, yes, you absolutely can do that. I would be very careful. Sometimes, yes, you do want to remove a breath, but I would be careful and not. I would be careful. I would be careful. To me, if I hear a voiceover recording without any breaths whatsoever in it, I guess it depends on the type of piece. Plenty of commercial pieces probably don't want any breaths. Totally get it. And I think Rob brings up a good point here regarding breath treatment. If the big breaths aren't on camera, you can use a piece of room tone to replace the sound too. Absolutely. Completely agree with that in both cases. Or Miguel, yes. Rob, yes. Completely agree. However, for podcasts or some other type of spoken word content, I don't like to, you can shorten the breaths, you can reduce them, but I don't like to get rid of them because then it starts to sound really otherworldly. And I think unnatural too. It sounds very, to me, oppressively edited when you're doing a long form type of content. So I'd be really careful about that as well. It's partly a taste thing. SoundSpeed says, expanding down breaths is helpful and probably the most sound-friendly way of getting acceptable results. Not overly aggressive processing, but takes the curse off of it. And that's generally my approach too, Alan. That's how I address that as well, especially if it is on camera. Limiters make for a safety net. Low cuts cut into potentially useful sound that post would like. After talking to some post guys, I've stopped recommending roll-off because they can dial it in better. And you just live with the fact that you have less headroom. Okay. Fair enough. Kevin, you're at 196,000 subs on the other channel. Wow. Any plans for a 200,000 celebration of some sort? Well, no. No plans whatsoever. We could put some plans together. I mean, I think it's fun. I think it's amazing that the community is growing. I want to be careful though. I don't see subscribers as like something I've earned. And to me, that just doesn't feel right. To me, it's if somebody subscribes to the channel, it's just, I don't know. There's part of me that says it's a vanity metric. Completely agree. That's my friend McGuire calls it. He just dismisses it as a vanity metric, and I agree at some level. But it's also, to me, it's an indicator that there is a community building up that finds value in the overall community, not just what I'm doing, but the advice they're getting from others in the community, like on these live streams. So there is value, but I don't have anything specific planned just yet. Maybe we'll do a fun live stream, Kevin, and you can come as well. Tobias, do you think we will see a blockbuster movie with a Rode Go microphone hanging visible in the future? I don't think so. However, you will see them in news, definitely, and Mike actually just points that out here. He has seen a wireless Go 2 appearing in some BBC News packages recently. I think you'll see them definitely in news. I don't think in major motion pictures with big budgets, you shouldn't be seeing those. And I hope you don't. Curtis will celebrate 200,000 subs by drinking a Zip Fizz and then falling over and going and eating a McDonald's fish sandwich. Are you kidding me? Are you people trying to kill me? No, we're not going to celebrate that way. If we're going to celebrate, we're going to eat some of Danny's food, not that stuff that you just said. And Danny's typing something, so I don't even know what's going on anymore. I'm getting attacked from all sides. All right. Thank you, everybody, so much for... Danny will intervene. She will actually provide me a fish sandwich of her own making. And maybe we'll see them as props. We could potentially do that as props, yes. A 2-day-old. What are they called? Filet of fish? That wouldn't smell very good either. All right, everybody. This has been fun. Thank you so much for joining. Thank you so much for everyone who's provided input and helps out our little community here, helping us all to grow and learn together. Get out there and make some great sound. And we will talk to you again next week. Take care, everybody.